The Buddha never said there is no self. Here's why. One of the biggest misunderstandings about Buddhism is the belief that the Buddha taught that there is no self. Actually, the existence or non-existence of the self was an issue he refused to get involved with. He had a policy that there were certain questions he would not answer, and one of the questions he wouldn't answer was, "Do I have a self? Do I have no self?" He said that if you held to the position either that you had a self or that you had no self, you would get involved in a tangle of views that would get in the way of awakening. So he would put that question aside. What he did talk about was the process he called I-making, or my-making, by which you create a sense of self. There are also times when we deny that something is us or ours. He saw both of these processes, self-making and not self-making, as actions. And the question about actions always is, are they skillful or not? In other words, when is creating a sense of self a skillful action? And when is it more skillful to say that something is not yourself? What ways of creating a self are skillful and what ways are not? What ways of saying not self are skillful and what ways are not? Selves and not self. In both cases, the concepts of self and not self are perceptions, and we use both of these perceptions as strategies to find happiness. For example, with the perception of self, when you have a desire and you want to bring the desire about, you create two senses of self. The first is the self as the consumer, the you that will enjoy the results of getting that desire fulfilled. Then there's the self as the producer, the self that will actually be able to bring that thing about. For example, if you have a desire for a vegan pizza, the self as the consumer is your sense of yourself as the person who will enjoy eating vegan pizza. The sense of self as the producer is the self who has the skills and means to bring this about, either the self who has the money to buy the pizza or the self who has the ability to get the ingredients to make the pizza. Now, this applies to all kinds of desires, both skillful and unskillful. Even to practice the path, you also need both senses of self. For example, Ven Ananda, who was one of the Buddha's foremost disciples, said that you need to have a healthy sense of self as a producer. He expressed it in this way. You think of the fact that there are other people who have gained awakening. They are human beings. I'm a human being. They can do it. Why can't I? That's a healthy sense of self as a producer on the path, the self that feels capable of following the path. As for the self as a consumer, the Buddha recommends that when you're getting discouraged in the practice, you should remind yourself that you got on the path because you wanted to find a way to the end of suffering. You loved yourself. If you give up on the practice, does that mean you don't love yourself anymore? This is a healthy sense of self as a consumer on the path. As we go through life, we create many different selves around our different desires because we see that they're helpful in bringing about whatever it is we want. It's in this way that they're strategies for happiness. The same principle applies to not self. You see that there are certain things that are not worth desiring, or certain ideas or certain habits that are getting in the way of your desires, and you decide that you're not going to identify with them anymore. Now, as we go through life ordinarily, we tend to adopt these different strategies of self and not self without thinking too much about them. For example, think back to when you were a child. If some children down the street were beating up on your little sister, you'd think, "This is my sister. I have to go defend her." But when you got her safely back home and she started playing with your toys, she wasn't your sister anymore. She was the other. We apply these different perceptions pretty unconsciously as we go through life, but when we come to the practice, the Buddha asks us to be more systematic in applying them for the sake of putting an end to suffering. For example, when you're practicing the precepts, there may be some things that would pull you away from practicing the precepts. Suppose that someone were to offer you some money to lie. You'd have to remind yourself, that money is not really mine. The things that I could buy with that money would leave me after a while. So, you apply the perception of self to your precepts, and a perception of not self to the money and the things you would buy with the money you'd gain from lying. That helps you to stick with your precepts. Similarly, when you're practicing concentration, the object of the concentration is yours, and the person meditating is you. As for any distracting thoughts that would come up, that's when you think about how the perceptions and thought fabrications in that distracting thought are not self. It's in this way that you learn how to apply these perceptions of self and not self more systematically, so that both the strategy of self and the strategy of not self actually are conducive to a genuine happiness. It's only when you've fully developed all the factors of the path that you let go of everything, because you found a happiness that doesn't require any strategies anymore, and the only way to fully experience that happiness is to let go of everything. You don't identify with perceptions of self, and at that point, even the perception of not self is something you don't identify with either. You have to let that go as well. That's the way you can find the ultimate happiness. So, to understand the teaching on not self, we have to view it within the context of the teaching on kamma. This is the opposite of what many people usually do. They make the teaching on not self the context, interpreting it as saying there is no self, and then they say, well, how does the teaching on kamma fit into that? And it doesn't fit very well, because it seems like the Buddha is saying there is no agent deciding how to act, and there's no one being affected by the action, so why should kamma matter? The Buddha, however, took the issue the other way around. He started with the principle that there are skillful and unskillful actions, and some skillful actions can be so skillful that they can take you all the way to nibbana. The question of self as an activity and not self as an activity fits into that context very well. You use perceptions of self and perceptions of not self when they're helpful for the path. In that way, they enable you to follow this path, which the Buddha called the kamma that leads to the end of kamma. Then, when you reach the end of kamma, you also reach the end of the perceptions of self and not self. All that's left is the ultimate happiness. And as Ajahn Suwat used to say, once you've found that ultimate happiness, you're not interested in asking whether there is or is not a self experiencing it. The experience is there, with no need for strategies to attain or maintain it, and it's totally satisfying. Not self for transcendent happiness. Last night we talked about the teaching on not self on the mundane level as it relates to the issue of rebirth and kamma. On this level, you apply the perception of not self in a selective way. You look at the skills you can take with you. You figure out what things would prevent you from taking good skills with you, and you try to perceive the second set of things as not self. In this way, you can develop the conditions for a good rebirth and the ability to deal with whatever you may encounter as you go through the cycle of death and rebirth. But as you contemplate the issue of rebirth, you begin to see that even if you develop good mental qualities, the whole process is still very risky and uncertain. When things get comfortable, it's very easy to get complacent and to forget to keep working at developing good qualities. And even the best life in the cosmos has to end in separation and death. You've experienced these sufferings countless times in the past, and if you don't gain release from the process of rebirth, you'll have to endure the same sufferings countless times in the future. When this realization goes deeply into the heart, you're ready for the transcendent teaching on not self. That's the topic for tonight's talk. The transcendent teaching on not self derives from transcendent right view, and transcendent right view comes in two stages. The first stage sees experience in terms of the four noble truths of suffering. its origination, its cessation, and the path of practice leading to its cessation. As you may remember, each of these truths carries a duty. If you want to put an end to suffering, suffering should be comprehended, its cause should be abandoned, its cessation should be realized, and the path to its cessation should be developed as a skill. The purpose of the Transcendent teaching on not-self is to help you perform each of these duties. In the first noble truth, the Buddha identifies suffering with the 5 clinging aggregates. Notice that the aggregates themselves are not suffering. The mind suffers because it clings to them. As I've already mentioned, clinging is also similar to the process of feeding. We keep doing something again and again, that's the clinging, as a means of finding happiness. That's the feeding. A good example of this is an experiment some neurobiologists once did with mice. They located the pleasure center in each mouse's brain and planted a little electrode in there. When the mice pushed their heads against a little bar, the bar would give a mild electric stimulation to the pleasure center. They got so addicted to pressing their heads against the bar, doing it again and again and again, that they forgot to eat and they died. They were feeding on a pleasure that was very immediate and intense, but provided no nourishment. That's why they died. The same principle applies to the human mind. We usually feed on the aggregates in a way that provides no real nourishment, and so our goodness dies. On the transcendent level of right view, the Buddha has us use the perception of not-self as a means for comprehending this clinging and feeding to the point where we feel no more passion for it. But his approach is a little indirect. As we've already seen, instead of telling you simply to stop feeding on the aggregates, he has you turn them into a path. The health food that gives strength to the mind to the point where it no longer needs to feed. The primary example of this is the practice of right concentration. As we've already said, right concentration is composed of the 5 aggregates, and the feelings of ease, rapture, and refreshment that come from right concentration are health food for the mind. You learn through this practice that you can find a sense of happiness that comes from within, and you no longer need to go looking for nourishment outside. To develop this sort of concentration, you have to apply the perception of not-self in a selective way. You hold on to your concentration and apply the perception of not-self to any distracting thoughts that would pull you away from the object of your concentration. As you gain skill and maturity in applying this perception in this way, it can enable you to let go of many attachments to other, lesser forms of happiness that you now realize you no longer need. In particular, the pleasures of sensuality. When you realize you no longer need them, you find that there was nothing really there. One of my favorite cartoons shows a group of cows in a pasture. One of the cows is jerking its head up in a sudden state of surprise and realization, saying, "Hey, wait a minute, this is grass. We've been eating grass." The canon has a similar story. A blind man has been given an old dirty rag and told that it's a clean white cloth. He's very protective of his clean white cloth. But then his relatives take him to a doctor and the doctor cures his blindness. He looks at the cloth and realizes that he was fooled. It's just a dirty old rag. The Dhamma point, both in the cartoon and in the story, is that we often blindly look for pleasure in things that, when we come to our senses, we realize were never all that satisfying to begin with. In some cases, the pleasure is actually unhealthy, causing you to do things you later regret. The practice of jhana provides the perspective that allows you to step back from your sensual passions and all your other unskillful ways of looking for pleasure to see that they weren't worth the effort put into gaining them. This forces you to step back from the unskillful committee members that push for those ways of looking for pleasure, and to ask whether you want to continue associating and identifying with them or not. This process isn't always easy. You tend to identify with those unskillful committee members because you associate them with pleasure. But the practice of jhana helps make this process of disidentification possible. When you can see that, in comparison to the blameless pleasure of jhana, these other committee members also bring you stress and pain, you can more easily regard them as not self. You can let them go. As the practice of jhana matures, there eventually comes a point when you realize that only one attachment remains blocking unconditioned happiness, and that's attachment to the path itself, in particular to the practice of concentration and the development of discernment. This is where the Buddha starts having you apply the transcendent teaching on not-self all around, and not just selectively. In other words, you apply the perception of not-self to every instance of clinging to the aggregates, even to the aggregates that go into jhana and discernment. This is how the not-self teaching helps you with the duties of comprehending stress and abandoning every form of craving, clinging, passion, or delight that would give rise to stress. The following passage shows the main stages in this process. First, you master the state of jhana. Then you try to develop perceptions that give rise to a sense of dispassion for the jhana. Once you've developed that sense of dispassion, you develop the perception in which you see all-around dispassion and cessation as desirable. Then you learn how to drop even that perception and stay right there. That, the Buddha says, is where full awakening can occur. Suppose that an archer or archer's apprentice were to practice on a straw man or mound of clay, so that after a while he would become able to shoot long distances, to fire accurate shots in rapid succession, and to pierce great masses. In the same way, there is the case where a monk enters and remains in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. He regards whatever phenomena there that are connected with form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and consciousness as inconstant, stressful, a disease, a cancer, an arrow, painful, an affliction, alien, a disintegration, an emptiness, not self. He turns his mind away from those phenomena, and having done so, inclines his mind to the property of deathlessness. This is peace, this is exquisite, the pacification of all fabrications, the relinquishing of all acquisitions, the ending of craving, dispassion, cessation, unbinding. Staying right there, he reaches the ending of the fermentations. Or if not, then, through this very Dhamma passion, this Dhamma delight, and from the total wasting away of the first 5 fetters, self-identity views, grasping at habits and practices, uncertainty, sensual passion, and irritation, he is due to arise spontaneously in the pure abodes, there to be totally unbound, never again to return from that world. Similarly with the second, third, and fourth jhana, and 936. A couple of points in this passage need to be explained. First, when the Buddha talks about the ending of fermentation, he's talking about awakening. The fermentations are the defilements that come bubbling up in the mind. Second, with regard to the second stage where the Buddha says to perceive the aggregates in the jhana as inconstant, stressful, etc., there are other passages in the canon that expand on this point. In these passages, the Buddha recommends that you apply 3 questions derived from the original question that he said was the basis of discernment. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? At this point in the practice, he recommends looking more closely at the idea of long-term happiness. Focus on the word long-term. You know that jhana is a long-term happiness, but now you realize that long-term is no longer good enough. It's inconstant. The Pāli term here, anicca, is sometimes translated as impermanent, but that's not what it really means. Its opposite, nicca, describes something that's done constantly and reliably. You can depend on it. But if something is anicca, it's unreliable. It wavers. If you try to base your happiness on it, you have to keep tensing up around it. like trying to find some rest while sitting on a chair with wobbly, uneven legs. So when you see that even the long-term happiness of jhana is inconstant, unreliable and wavering, you realize that it's not really all that pleasant. Even in what pleasure it does offer, there is stress. And because there's stress, why would you want to claim it as yours? This line of thinking corresponds to the 3 questions that the Buddha has you ask at this stage in the practice. The first is this constant? And the answer is no. That leads to the next question. If it's inconstant, is it pleasant? Again, the answer is no. That leads to the third question. If something is inconstant and stressful, is it fitting to say that this is me, this is myself, this is what I am? In other words, is it skillful to lay claim to this? And the answer again is no. Now, notice that the Buddha is not asking you to come to the conclusion that there is no self. He's simply asking you to see if this way of creating a sense of self is skillful. His method of analysis, when it's consistently applied to all of the aggregates, gives rise to a sense of disenchantment and dispassion for any possible type of clinging. But notice, you're not doing this out of pessimism. You're doing this for the sake of your own true happiness, but now it's better than long-term, longer than long-term. You want something totally timeless and reliable. As that passage just now indicated, sometimes this series of questions leads to full awakening, but sometimes it doesn't. It leads instead to the state of non-return. Now, the level of awakening at non-return is not bad. A group of people once came to see my teacher, Ajahn Fuang. They had been studying Buddhist philosophy and had heard that he was a good teacher, but they didn't know what he taught. So they came and asked him to teach them. He said, "Okay, close your eyes and focus on your breath." And they said, No, we can't do that." He asked, "Why?" And they said, "If we focus on the breath, we'll get stuck on jhana and then we'll be reborn as Brahmas." And Ajahn Fuang responded, "What's wrong with being reborn as a Brahma? Even non-returners are born as Brahmas. And being reborn as a Brahma is better than being reborn as a dog." In other words, if you haven't attained jhana, it's hard to let go of sensual passions. And people stuck on sensual passions, even if they've studied Buddhist philosophy, can easily be reborn as dogs. So the dangers of jhana and non-return are much slighter than the dangers of not reaching those attainments. Still, if possible, the Buddha does encourage you to try to go beyond the level of non-return and gain full awakening. This is where he brings in another teaching, another perception. In Pāli, the phrase is "Sabbe Dhamma Anatta," which means all phenomena are not self. This applies both to fabricated phenomena and unfabricated phenomena. And it's important to note here that this perception is part of the path, not the goal. In other words, it's not the conclusion you come to when you arrive at awakening. It's a perception you use to get beyond your last attachments. As the above passage states, what keeps a non-returner from gaining total awakening is a type of passion and delight. Passion for the deathless and delight in the deathless. Passion and delight is another term for clinging. Even when the mind lets go of its clinging and passion for the aggregates, there still is something it may cling to, the experience of the deathless that follows after letting go of the aggregates. The mind can regard its experience of the deathless as a phenomenon, as an object of the mind. Where there is an object, there is a subject, the knowing self, the sense of I am. And this provides a foothold for passion and delight to arise. You instinctively want to control whatever you like, and so you try to control the experience of the deathless, even though the idea of control here is superfluous. The deathless isn't going to change on you, and counterproductive. The self created around this desire for control actually gets in the way of total freedom. To counter this tendency toward control, the Buddha here has you apply the perception that all phenomena are not self, even to the experience of the deathless. This is what gets rid of the I in I am. There's another passage relevant to this point where the Buddha says that when you see all phenomena arising and passing away, and this includes everything, including the path and your clinging to the deathless, when you watch everything arising all the time, the idea of non-existence doesn't occur to the mind. When you see these things passing away, the idea of existence doesn't occur to the mind. At that point, the ideas of existence and non-existence are irrelevant to your experience. All you see is stress arising, stress passing away. This has several ramifications. If ideas of existence and non-existence don't occur to you, then the question of whether the self exists or doesn't exist wouldn't occur to you either. This gets rid of the am in I am. This also does away with your fear of going out of existence if things are let go, because the mind isn't thinking in those terms. At the same time, you're reaching the higher stage of transcendent right view with a higher and more refined level of duty. As you remember with the Four Noble Truths, each of the truths has a duty, but in this case, when you see everything arising and passing away simply as stress, all the duties are reduced to one. You comprehend things to the point of dispassion. This means that you let go even of concentration, even of discernment, even of the act of clinging to the deathless. In the words of Ajahn Mun, all Four Noble Truths are turned into one. They all carry the same duty, which is to let go of everything. This allows the mind to experience nibbana not as a phenomenon, but as a total experience. At this point, you've found total happiness, which no longer needs any protection, no longer needs to be maintained. There's no longer any issue of control or non-control. There's no need for the strategy of self to create this happiness, and no need for a sense of self to consume or experience it. Where you don't draw a line to define self, there's no line to define not self. Where there's no clinging, there's no need for the strategy of not self. So strategies of self or not self are all put aside. Even the strategy of dispassion itself gets put aside. At this point, the mind no longer has need for any strategies at all because it has found a happiness that's truly solid. It's not a phenomenon, it's a happiness. The Buddha calls it a special form of consciousness that doesn't need to be experienced through the six senses, or what he calls the all. It's directly experienced as total freedom. And at the moment of awakening, there's no experience of the six senses. However, after the moment of awakening, when the mind returns to the experience of the senses, this sense of freedom stays. The canon illustrates this with an image, not a pretty image, but very memorable. The image is this. Suppose there's a dead cow. You take a knife and remove the skin, cutting all of the tendons and tissues that connect the skin to the cow. Then you put the skin back on. The question is the skin still attached to the cow as it was before? And the answer is no. Even though it's right next to the cow, it's no longer attached. In the same way, the practice of discernment is like a knife. It cuts through all of the attachments between the senses and their objects. Once the attachments are gone, then even if you put the knife away, you cannot connect things in the way they were before. The eye still sees forms, the ear hears sounds, but there's a sense that these things are no longer joined. As I said, the image isn't pretty, but it conveys the point that once total freedom is found, it's never lost. One final point. As we said in one of the earlier talks, you are limited by what you are obsessed with. You define yourself by your obsessions and attachments, and that sort of definition places limitations on you. When there are no longer any attachments or obsessions, you are no longer defined. And because you are no longer defined, you can't be described as existing, not existing neither, or both. In other words, ideas of the existence of the self and the non-existence of the self no longer apply. As for perceptions of self and not self, Those are like the knife that has been used to cut things through, but now has been put aside. Out of the thicket and onto the path. Tonight, I'd like to talk more about why the Buddha refused to get involved in the issue of whether there is or is not a self. This will involve discussing in more detail two of the points I made last night. The first point is that the Buddha's teaching was strategic, aimed at leading to a specific goal, total freedom in the minds of his listeners. The second point is that, as part of this larger strategy, the Buddha had strategic reasons for putting questions of the existence or non-existence of the self aside. Part of his teaching strategy was to divide questions into 4 types, based on how they should be best approached for the purpose of putting an end to suffering and stress. The first type includes those that deserve a categorical answer. In other words, a straight yes or no, this or that, with no exceptions. The second type includes questions that deserve an analytical answer, in which the Buddha would reanalyze the question before answering it. The third type includes questions that deserve a counter-question. In other words, he would question the questioner before answering the original question. And the fourth type includes questions that deserve to be put aside as useless or even harmful in the quest to put an end to suffering. And, as I said, the questions, is there a self? Is there no self? Are ones he put aside. Here's the passage where he explains why. Then Vacchagotta the Wanderer went to the Blessed One, and on arrival, exchanged courteous greetings with him. After an exchange of friendly greetings and courtesies, he sat down to one side. As he was sitting there, he asked the Blessed One, "Now then, Master Gautama, is there a self?" When this was said, the Blessed One was silent. "Then is there no self?" The second time the Blessed One was silent. Then Vacchagotta the Wanderer got up from his seat and left. Then not long after Vacchagotta the Wanderer had left, Venerable Ananda said to the Blessed One, "Why, Lord, did the Blessed One not answer when asked a question by Vacchagotta the Wanderer?" And here's the Buddha's response. "Ananda, if I, being asked by Vacchagotta the Wanderer if there is a self, were to answer that there is a self, that would be conforming with those Brahmins and contemplatives who are exponents of eternalism, the view that there is an eternal, unchanging soul. If I, being asked by Vacchagotta the Wanderer if there is no self, were to answer that there is no self, that would be conforming with those Brahmins and contemplatives who are exponents of annihilationism, the view that death is the annihilation of the self. If I, being asked by Vacchagotta the Wanderer if there is a self, were to answer that there is a self, would that be in keeping with the arising of knowledge that all phenomena are not self?" And Venerable Ananda said, "No, Lord." Then the Buddha said, "And if I, being asked by Vacchagotta the Wanderer if there is no self, were to answer that there is no self, the bewildered Vacchagotta would become even more bewildered. Does the self that I used to have now not exist?" SN 44:10. Notice that only one of the Buddha's reasons for putting these questions aside concerns the person asking them. Vacchagotta would be bewildered by the answer. The other 3 reasons state that any answer to these questions would either side with wrong views or would get in the way of an insight that, as we will see, is an important step at an advanced stage of the path. Also notice that the Buddha is not giving an analytical answer to either of Vacchagotta's questions, nor is he giving a counter-question such as, "What kind of self do you mean?" This rules out the idea that the not-self teaching is aimed at negating specific ideas of self. In other words, that the answer would depend on what you mean by self. However, most popular misinterpretations of the not-self teaching give just this kind of answer to these questions. In other words, it depends on what kind of self we're talking about. Certain types of self exist, whereas other types don't. What this means is that these misinterpretations say that the Buddha didn't answer Vacchagotta's categorical question because it required an analytical answer. But as we have seen, the Buddha knew how to give analytical answers to categorical questions whenever he needed to, and he had his reasons for putting these questions on the existence or non-existence of the self aside. But because these popular misinterpretations are so pervasive, it's important that we look at them in some detail to see why they are misinterpretations, how they misunderstand the Buddha's approach and place obstacles in the path. Otherwise, it's all too easy for us to fall into these misunderstandings ourselves. One misinterpretation is that the Buddha's not-self teaching is aimed specifically at negating the view of self proposed in the Brahmanical Upanishads, that the self is permanent, cosmic, and identical with God. But the Buddha is not negating the fact that we each have an individual self. In other words, he's saying, yes, you have an individual self, but no, you don't have a cosmic God self. The second misinterpretation is the exact opposite. The Buddha is negating the idea that you have a small, separate self, but he's affirming the existence of a large, interconnected, cosmic self. In other words, he's saying, yes, you do have a connected self, but no, you don't have a separate self. The third misinterpretation is similar to the first, but it introduces the idea that a self, to be a true self, has to be permanent. According to this interpretation, the Buddha is affirming that the 5 aggregates are what you are, but these 5 aggregates don't really qualify to be called a self because they aren't permanent. They're just processes. In other words, no, you don't have a self, but yes, you're a bunch of processes. The aggregates are what you are. None of these interpretations fit in with the Buddha's actual teachings, or his actual approach to the question of whether there is or is not a self. They misrepresent the Buddha both for formal reasons, the fact that they give an analytical answer to a question the Buddha put aside, and for reasons of content. They don't fit in with what the Buddha actually had to say on the topic of self and not self. For example, with the first misinterpretation, that the Buddha is denying the cosmic self found in the Upanishads, it turns out that the Upanishads contain many different views of the self, and the Buddha himself gives an analysis of those different kinds. He finds 4 main varieties. One is that the self has a form and is finite. For example, that your self is your conscious body and will end when the body dies. The second type is that the self has a form and is infinite. For example, the view that the self is equal to the cosmos. The third type is that the self is formless and finite. This is similar to the Christian idea of the soul. It doesn't have a shape, and its range is limited. The fourth view is that the self is formless and infinite. For example, the belief that the self is the infinite spirit or energy that animates the cosmos. The Buddha says that each of these 4 varieties of self-theory comes in 3 different modes as to when and how the self is that way. One is that the self already is that way. Another is that the self naturally changes to be that way. For example, when you fall asleep or when you die. The third is that the self is changeable through the will. In other words, through meditation and other practices, you can change the nature of yourself. For example, from being finite to being infinite. Multiply the 4 varieties of self by their 3 modes, and you have 12 types of theories about the self. All of these theories the Buddha rejects. He doesn't agree with any of them because they all involve clinging, which is something you have to comprehend and let go. This means that his not-self teaching is not just negating specific types of self, such as a cosmic self, a permanent self, or an ordinary individual self. It negates every imaginable way of defining the self. As for the second misinterpretation, that the Buddha is actually affirming the cosmic or interconnected self, the evidence I've already given you shows that that cannot be the case. There is also a passage in the canon where he says specifically that the idea of a cosmic self is especially foolish. His argument is this: if there is a self, there must be what belongs to a self. If your self is cosmic, then the whole cosmos must belong to you. But does it? No. Does it lie under your control? No. Therefore, it doesn't deserve to be called yours. As for the third misinterpretation, that the 5 aggregates aren't a self because they aren't permanent, but nevertheless, the 5 aggregates are what you are. The Buddha says repeatedly that it's not fitting to identify the aggregates as what I am. As we will see later, he explains the 5 aggregates as the raw material from which you create your sense of self, but that it's not skillful to think that they constitute what you are. Another problem with this misinterpretation is that it opens the Buddha to charges of lying in the many passages where he does refer to the self in a positive way, as when he says that the self is its own mainstay. If there really is no self at all, why does he talk about it as if it exists? To get around this problem, the interpretation introduces the distinction between 2 levels of truth, conventional and ultimate. Thus, it says, when the Buddha is talking about self, he's doing so only in a conventional way. On the ultimate level, no self exists. The problem with this distinction is that the Buddha himself never uses it. It was introduced into the tradition at a much later date, and if it were so central to understanding his teachings, you'd think that he would have mentioned it, but he didn't. There's also the problem that if the aggregates were what you are, then, because nibbana is the ending of the aggregates, that would mean that when you attain nibbana, you would be annihilated. The Buddha, however, denied that nibbana was annihilation. At the same time, what good would be the end of suffering if it meant total annihilation? Only people who hate themselves or hate all experience would go for it. And as for the idea that only a permanent identity deserves to be called a self, it's not the case that the Buddha would tell you to create a sense of self around the experience of something unchanging or permanent. As we will see, at an advanced level of the practice, he tells you to develop the perception of not self, even for the phenomenon of the deathless, which is something that doesn't change. The problem with the act of self-identification is not just that it's mistakenly focused on impermanent objects when it should be focused on permanent objects. It ultimately shouldn't be focused on anything at all, because it always involves clinging, regardless of what it's focused on, and clinging involves suffering and stress. The whole point of the Buddha's teaching is to put an end to suffering and stress. So when the Buddha refused to answer Vacchagotta's questions, it wasn't because he had an analytical answer in mind that he couldn't explain to Vacchagotta, but would perhaps explain to others. It was because, in order to avoid getting involved with issues that get in the way of putting an end to suffering, these questions deserve to be put aside no matter who asked them. In fact, there's another sutta passage that makes precisely this point. No matter who you are, if you try to answer the question, do I exist or do I not exist? Or what am I? You get entangled in views like, I have a self or I have no self, which the Buddha calls a thicket of views, a wilderness of views. The image is clear. If you're entangled in a thicket or a wilderness, you've wandered far from the path and will have trouble getting back on course. The main point to take from all of this is that the Buddha is not interested in defining what you are or what yourself is. He's a lot more compassionate than that. He wants you to see how you define your own sense of self. After all, you're not responsible for how he might define yourself, and his definition of yourself is not really your problem. But you are responsible for the way you define yourself, and that very much is your problem. When you define yourself through ignorance, you suffer, and you often cause the people around you to suffer as well. As a first step in putting an end to this suffering, you have to bring awareness to the process by which you create your sense of self so that you can clearly see what you're doing and why it's causing that suffering. This is why the Buddha aims at getting you to understand that process in line with his two categorical teachings. He wants you to see how your act of self-definition fits within the Four Noble Truths, and to see when it's skillful and when it's not, so that you can use this knowledge to put an end to suffering. When it's skillful, you use it. When it's not, you regard it as not self, so that you can stop clinging to it and can put it aside. It's possible to create a huge variety of selves. As the Buddha once said, the mind can take on more shapes than all the species of animals in the world. Think of what that means. All the whales and insects and everything in between. Your selves are even more variegated than that. If you watch your sense of self during the day, you'll see that it continually changes its shape, like an amoeba. Sometimes it looks like a dog, sometimes a person, sometimes a heavenly being, sometimes a shapeless blob. However, all of these ways of creating a self can be analyzed down to the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, fabrication, and consciousness. The Buddha doesn't say that these aggregates are what your self is. They're simply the raw materials from which you create your sense of self. As he notes, you can create 4 different kinds of self out of each of these aggregates. Take the form of the body as an example. 1. You can equate the aggregate with yourself. For example, you can say that your body is yourself. 2. You can also say that your self possesses that aggregate. For example, that you have a self that possesses a body. 3. You could also have the idea that your self is inside that aggregate. For example, that you have a self inside the body. A few years back, I got into a discussion with my older brother about how we had visualized the soul back when we were children. We both imagined that it was something inside the body, but we had different ideas about what it looked like. Mine was less imaginative. Because the English word soul sounds like sole, the bottom of your shoe, I thought my soul looked like a glowing piece of leather in a dark space. However, my brother was more imaginative. His soul looked like a rusty can with an iron rod stuck in it. Where he got that image, I have no idea. At any rate, those are examples of a self conceived of as being inside the body, the third way you could define a soul around the aggregate of form. 4. The fourth way that you can create a sense of self around an aggregate is to say that the aggregate lies inside yourself. For example, you have a cosmic self that encompasses your body, that is larger than your body, and your body moves around within that vast self. All of these ways of defining the self, the Buddha says, cause suffering. This is why he advises you ultimately to put them all aside. But some of them do have their uses on the path, which is why he has you develop them in a skillful way before you drop them. So instead of getting into a discussion as to which type of self is your true self, or your ultimate self, or your conventional self, the Buddha is more interested in showing you how your sense of self is an action. The adjectives he uses to describe actions are not ultimate or conventional. They're skillful and unskillful. These are the terms in which he wants you to understand yourselves. Are they skillful? Are they not? And because skill can be understood only through mastery, the Buddha wants you to master these actions in practice. As it turns out, each of the aggregates is also an action. When you take on the idea of form in the mind, there is actually a decision in the mind to take on that form. That decision is an action. Feeling is also an action. Perception is an action. Fabrication is an action, as is consciousness. If you cling to any of these activities, that too is an action. The act of taking delight in repeating that activity again and again. There are 3 reasons why it's useful to analyze your ways of creating a self in this fashion. First, it shows that regardless of how you identify yourself, it always involves clinging. Wherever there's clinging, there's also suffering and stress. This is why the ordinary way of creating a sense of self falls under the first noble truth. If the object you're clinging to changes, you suffer from its change. Even if it changes for the better, you realize that its nature is not permanent, therefore, it cannot be trusted. Even if you cling to the idea of something permanent, the idea is itself impermanent, as is the clinging to the idea. When you see the activity of creating a self in this way, it gives rise to a sense of disenchantment and dispassion, 2 emotions that can lead to release. That's the first reason why it is useful to think of the self as activity in this way. When you see it as an activity, it's easier to apply the perception of not self to it so that you can end the suffering that comes from clinging to it. The second reason for analyzing your ways of creating a self is that, as the Buddha once said, however you define yourself, you limit yourself. For example, if you have the idea that you're intrinsically bad by nature, something that's intrinsically bad can't make itself good. You would need an outside power to help you. This would discourage you from practicing. If you have the idea that you're intrinsically good by nature, you would need to explain how something intrinsically good could suffer or could cause suffering. Also, if it could lose its original pure nature, then once you make it pure again, what would keep it from losing its pure nature again? There's also the practical concern that if you believe you're intrinsically good, it gives rise to complacency. You believe that any intuition that rises up from a quiet mind is trustworthy. In this way, your idea of an intrinsically good self obscures your defilements. This is the opposite of what we sometimes hear, that our defilements obscure our intrinsically good nature. But if you believe your nature is intrinsically good, then when defilements arise in the quiet mind and you identify them as the wisdom of your innate nature manifesting itself, your belief in your intrinsic goodness has blinded you to what's actually going on. Also, there are times in the meditation when the mind comes to a great state of emptiness, space, light, and peace. If you're looking for an innately pure and good Buddha nature, you could easily decide that that's your Buddha nature. However, the Buddha advises that even a great state like that should be analyzed to see where there is still some inconstancy and stress. In other words, to see that state of concentration as the result of actions and not as an innate state. Otherwise, again, you get complacent. And as the Buddha said, complacency is the opposite of the source of goodness. The source of goodness or skill is heedfulness. You also place limitations on yourself if you hold to the idea that you have no self. How could you function? How could you insist that people treat you fairly? What motivation would you have to avoid unskillful actions and to develop the skills of the path? Even the idea of a cosmic self has its limitations. It prevents you from seeing how you're actually functioning in the world and how you're creating suffering through your I-making and my-making in the present moment. It also provides you with excuses for your unskillful feelings. Whatever arises in the mind is simply the cosmos acting through you, and you take no personal responsibility for it. I once heard of a woman on a retreat who discovered a strong desire for a man sitting in front of her, so strong that she couldn't stay in the same room. So she went back to meditate in her dormitory room, and there she had a realization that this was not just her own desire, but it was the force of cosmic desire manifesting through her, and that she should just allow it to happen. When you believe something like that, it's impossible to practice. As long as you don't see that these things have their causes in your individual mind, you'll never be able to put an end to them. Every way of defining yourself also places a limitation on yourself in the sense that your definition of who you are and what belongs to you is going to conflict with somebody else's definition of who you are and what belongs to you. The Buddha has a special term for the type of thinking that starts with the thought of self-identification. I am the thinker. He calls it papanka, or objectification, and says that it lies at the basis of all conflict. When you start thinking in these terms, your thoughts turn around and bite you. So these are different ways in which defining what you are can give rise to limitations. When you learn how to drop these unskillful ways of creating a self, or even the idea that you have no self, you can free yourself from these limitations. Finally, there's a third benefit that comes from looking at the creation of a self as an action. You're free to create different senses of self that you can use as tools. You use them when they're needed, and you can put them down when they're not. And in fact, this is the Buddha's strategy. This is how we create a path to the end of suffering. We use conditioned things to reach the unconditioned. If you couldn't do that, you wouldn't be able to reach the unconditioned, because the unconditioned is not something that can be used. All you have to work with is conditioned phenomena. The way you use conditioned phenomena is by learning how to master them as skills. In other words, you turn these 5 aggregates into a path. You can think of the aggregates as bricks that you've been carrying in a sack over your shoulder, weighing you down. But instead of carrying them, you now put them down on the ground and make them into a path. For example, when you're in a state of concentration, the concentration is actually composed of the 5 aggregates. Form is your sense of the body as experience from within, which includes the breath. Feeling is the sense of pleasure or discomfort that can come with the breath. Perception is your mental image or label of breath that helps you to stick with the breath and to perceive the breath energy in different parts of the body. The Buddha once said that all states of concentration, except for the very highest, depend on perception because you have to keep a perception of the object in mind in order to stay with the object. As for fabrications, they include sentences in your mind that talk about the breath or the body, evaluating and adjusting the breath, evaluating how well your concentration is going, and finally, consciousness is your awareness of all of these other aggregate activities. When brought together into a state of concentration in this way, the 5 aggregates form a path. As you master this skill, you get to see how you create your sense of self around these aggregates, as the agent doing the concentration practice, and as the person enjoying its benefits. This is why the ability to create a set of skillful selves falls under the 4th noble truth. This ability allows you to see the process of I-making and my-making in action. It allows you to understand the powers and limitations of intentional action in leading to true happiness. This understanding is what leads to freedom. So learn to use these aggregates and the sense of self you build around them as tools leading to freedom instead of as burdens weighing you down. There's a story that illustrates this principle in T.H. White's retelling of the King Arthur legend, The Once and Future King. In this version of the story, when Arthur is a young boy, Merlin, the magician, turns him into different kinds of animals to teach him the lessons that can be learned from animals. In the final transformation, young Arthur is turned into a badger and goes down to visit an old badger in his burrow. It turns out that the old badger is like an Oxford Don, with many papers spilling out of desks and shelves filling his burrow. He's written a thesis about why man has dominion over the animals, and he reads his thesis to Arthur. His explanation is much like the creation story in the Bible, except that when God creates all the animals, He doesn't create them in different forms. He creates them all as identical embryos. Once they are created, He lines them up and announces that He's going to give them a boon. He'll allow them to change the shape of their bodies in any way they want, in order to survive better in the world. For example, they can change their mouths into offensive weapons or their arms into wings. However, there's one condition. Once they change their form, they have to stick with it. So, he said, step up and choose your tools. The different animals thought over their choices and one by one made their requests. The badgers, being very practical, asked to change their hands into garden forks, their teeth into razors, and their skin into shields. Some of the animals made choices that were very bizarre. For example, a toad who was going to live in the Australian desert asked to swap its entire body for blotting paper to soak up the water from the seasonal rains and store it for the rest of the year. At the end of the 6th day, there remained only one animal who had not changed its body parts for tools. That was man. So God asked man, "Well, our little man, you have thought over your choice for 2 days now. Obviously, you have made a wise choice. What is it?" And the little man said, "If it pleases you, I don't want to change any parts of my body for tools. I simply ask for the ability to make tools. For example, if I want to swim, I will make a boat. If I want to fly, I will make a flying boat." God was pleased. He said, "Well done. You have guessed our riddle. I will put you in charge of all of the other animals. They have limited themselves, but you have not limited yourself. You will always have many potentials." If we take away the theological elements of this story, we can draw a useful lesson from it about our ideas of self. If we create a fixed view of who or what we are, we limit ourselves. We keep on creating suffering and stress. But if we see that we can create many senses of self and can learn to use them as tools, we'll be in charge of our happiness. We can use these tools to bring suffering and stress to an end. As with any tools, we have to learn how to use them well, and part of using them well is learning how and when to put them down. Otherwise, they get in the way of what we're trying to do. If we carry them around all the time, they weigh us down for no purpose at all. This is where the teaching on not-self comes in. It, too, is an activity, a strategic activity, that has to be mastered as a skill. Knowing how to put down a particular sense of self when it's no longer skillful, and ultimately, when yourselves have taken you as far as they can, knowing how to let go of them all. When you understand both self and not-self as activities in this way, it's easy to see how the Buddha's teachings on this topic are answers to his basic question for fostering discernment. What, when I do it, will lead to long-term welfare and happiness? When, through practice, you've learned how to use perceptions of self and not-self in a skillful way, you'll know for yourself that these skills are a very effective answer to that question. So that's the message for tonight. For the next few nights, we'll explore the different ways in which the Buddha gives us lessons in how to use perceptions of self and not self as tools on the path.